over 1 year ago, ISWA decided to create a special working group, the aim of which was to offer a study and a report on the role of waste in a circular economy, which is what we are going to be presenting today. Antonis is the scientific and technical head of ISWA, and Bjorn is the leader of this working group producing the report. This report was submitted at the beginning of September. It was presented at ISWA's annual conference, and less than a month after its presentation, its launch, we are having the chance today of presenting it before you. This shows how our region can access practices and procedures which we believe are going to imply a significant change, not only with regard to waste management, but even more so, this is an endeavor that will create an economy at the service of the entire population. I will do something that tends to be done at the end of conferences, which is expressing our gratitude. We would like to express our gratitude to all those that have worked to organize this, our interpreters who are going to have to put up with us for an entire day. And of course, I would also like to thank all those that helped us out in organizing this event. I'm talking of people that helped us to organize this economically, such as SEAMSE, Benito Rossio, Ledesma, Tetra Pak, and also the institutional support of SEATS, Sempre, Colección Reciclado, the Argentinian Packaging Institute, and the Environment Working Group of the Argentine Industrial Association. So all of these institutions will be delivering presentations during the day. And let me share the idea here for this entire working day. I am going to try to share with you my own ideas on the conceptual framework that leads to this need of a change of paradigm. And, well, you may agree with me or not, but after that, Antonis is going to deliver a presentation of what he believes is the framework in which a circular economy will have a capacity for development. That is what he and several authors call the third industrial revolution, and Bjorn is going to be presenting the conclusions of the report. After the lunch break, the first presentation of the afternoon will be delivered by Mr. Kostas Velis. He will talk about new things and change, and he will talk about how change calls for adapting and how change also implies challenges. And Kostas Velis will talk about the different challenges that we will have to face in the different production process streams and waste streams. So I'm starting here with the idea of trying to define a framework which may condition all this activity. First of all, it's important to see what is going on from a scientific standpoint, that is, ideas that will obviously have a repercussion in daily practices. There are a lot of scientists that consider that we are undergoing a geologic era change. This new era change is the Anthropocene. It would be the geologic era affected by the activity of man. Well, the Anthropocene as a concept was presented for the first time in the year 2000, and the idea was that a number of activities carried out by man are crucial when it comes to modifying a number of functions of our planet taken as a whole. there is a number of physical, chemical, and biologic interrelationships that are added to interrelationships determined by social practices, culture, economy, the economy, etc. All of this adds to phenomena that are known by all of us and that are going to repeat themselves over and over today. The increase in the number of inhabitants of the world, the development of cities and megacities, the issue of the scarcity of some natural resources that need to be used for feeding this the entire world population, and also, on the other hand, consumption practices that, as we all know, lead to a permanent increase of consumption, actually. So what is being considered on the basis of the desire to create a new point for scientific study has to do with studying the interconnections of mankind as a whole with the environment, that is to say, an interconnection between man and the environment, which is characterized by these fast physical, chemical, and biological changes that are taking place at a breakneck speed. This is going to lead us to a new way for analyzing these processes, probably defining a number of methodological aspects, and why not new philosophical and ethical considerations that will end up leading to a new way of life. This is a further phase of this movement that was launched towards the end of the 1940s, when no one spoke about the environment, no one spoke about ecology. The idea of conservationism introduced by Leopold towards the end of the 1940s, the first studies with pesticides that led to a number of bans, the discussion by ARS, who towards the end of the 1960s posed debate also the excessive exploitation of natural resources, the limitations on development. You probably remember the idea of the limits to growth established by the Rome Club, and afterwards the entire process that had to do with trying to define what we know today as sustainable development based on the various conferences that have taken place so far and so on. So all of those processes acquire a specific characteristic nowadays, where we can see that a number of systemic changes are going to be necessary and required in order to supply a solution to a population that is ever growing and that is exercising increasing pressure on natural resources and our environment. So in this way, we are trying to turn our backs to the dualism between man and nature, which was created at the beginning of our history, and the objective is now to try and find a different interconnection between the human species and the environment. And somehow the idea is also to respond to the pressures exercised by the environment as a response to man's activities. Of course, oftentimes, as a result of the definition of risk that this implies, we tend to overexpose challenges and we tend to overexpose risks. And we sometimes tend to forget that the history of mankind, which goes back 4 million years, in that whole history we are just a teeny little dot in this entire history. And oftentimes we tend to forget that a number of geological changes, 5 mass species extinctions, transcendental changes in the temperatures of the planet, with the different glaciation periods and so on. So all of that leads us to understand that there is a different complexity involved, and this complexity, if we study it scientifically, this complexity might lead us to improve or to furnish ourselves with special conditions so that the spaceship that Fuller described in the 1950s might have a better destination. And actually, Fuller mentions this idea that we are like a small spaceship, and we are all members of the crew of that spaceship. So we need to find our destination in the middle of a million galaxies, of which the solar system is just a teeny little portion. So this idea was revisited towards the end of the 1970s by James Lovelock with his idea of Gaia. Gaia, a noun that stands for a self-regulated system where different species coexist and where different chemical, physical, and biological phenomena interact, and where human life is developed with its inherent cultural and economic characteristics. And why does he use this concept of Gaia? Gaia was a Greek goddess who represented the vision of order, but order originating from chaos. So this is what we always need to remember. There is no balance. Actually, what happens is a balancing of forces, and new living conditions can be generated out of this interaction of forces. The balance that we can obtain as human beings happens exactly at this point when we stop living. There, all the functions of our heartbeat lead us to the balance, which is death. Therefore, we need to be prepared to recognize the complexities of the different changes that will be necessary. As part of this idea of the Anthropocene, some people try to establish a differentiation of phases, and they tend to say that man is increasingly engaging in a number of activities, and these phases are consistent with the different industrial and post-industrial movements that mankind has seen, because actually the onset of this new geological era coincides with the start of the Industrial Revolution, that is to say, 18th, 19th centuries. So there is an entire acceleration process in connection with all these changes, which is associated to an increase in the use of fossil fuels and the idea that is involved in the incidence of climate change. And somehow this entire idea of creating a new phase of geologic evolution is because it is considered that we are going through the end of the Holocene, which is the top manifestation of the Quaternarian era, and which actually starts exactly when the last big glaciation happened. So modern history, where man begins to be Homo sapiens, started not so long ago as part of this universal history. The truth is that we have been around for over 11 years. So what was the first big revolution? Well, as a matter of fact, the biggest change in connection with the development of man was when man begins to manipulate seeds. That is what marks the big change. That is to say, when man, through his knowledge, succeeds in creating the first GMOs, the first genetically modified organisms, 10,000 years ago. That is, when man begins to manipulate seeds and when he begins to live his nomadic life and begins to prefer his a sedentary life, that is where the human conditions are created, where powers appear, where religions begin to appear, because at the end of the day, people began to realize that in order for a seed to produce its fruit, it required a certain consistency of climate phenomena that would guarantee a successful harvest. So asking a god to give them a gift, well, that was a way of recognizing that god and trusting that god in that god would help them to have the proper climate. Well, pantheism leads to polytheism, and then the Judeo-Christian tradition. Many of us belong to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and in the Bible itself, this is actually recognized in the Pope's last encyclical. In the Genesis, there already is reference to ruling the planet and also cultivating the garden of the world. That is what the Bible says. What does it mean to cultivate? It means planting seeds. It means working the soil. What does it mean to take care of our planet? It has to do with guaranteeing continuity for the subsequent generations. But the idea of tilling and planting and so on has to do with the fact that man began to influence nature. And from then on, man went on influencing nature. All of the changes that we introduce will have an impact on nature. People have already spoken about geoengineering to overcome climate change problems, and what we need to remember is that any change introduced by man on nature has no way of reverting. That is to say, there is no way of reconstituting what man impacts, the impacts that man produces on nature. It can be remediated, but it cannot be annulled or cancelled altogether. I once read an article that said that if, when agriculture was discovered, someone would have thought to sign an environmental agreement, of course, it would never have been approved, because agriculture was what actually changed the conditions of the earth from that moment onwards. Of course, the other big change that man has experienced, and that is why we are now talking about a new geological era, was the Industrial Revolution with its technological changes, the creation of new waste, of new types of waste, because each technological change goes hand in hand with the onset, with the creation of new streams of waste, etc. Why has man done all this? Well, because the secret of life has to do with owning energy, and that is the energy that we need to live, and all living organisms need to transform the energy of plants, the energy of microorganisms, and, well, even we as human beings need to transform our energy. We need that energy to which we get from food, actually. Energy is obtained from food, and that is the way development is enabled. Today we are faced with a rising population, rising urbanizations, the scarcity of resources, and all of those are problems that need to be solved. Also, this has a specific way of production, that's the linear economy, which has been described in the last Pope's encyclical, which has to do with producing, consuming, and throwing out. This linear idea, or this idea of linear economy, is what we are trying to change, and that is what you will hear as a basic criteria of the circular economy.
All these characteristics of the world where we live in, some say that we are vis-a-vis dystopy, a term coined by John Stuart Mill by the end of the 1800s, where he meant a utopian world, negative one, antithetic terms vis-a-vis an ideal society. Therefore, we would be facing something that we have to cope with and overcome. Here it is absolutely valid, the Einstein's saying, where we say that we can all solve problems thinking in the same way as we used to think when we created the problems, a change of action, and thinking, a change of mindset. All this, through different authors, was given different names, such as a necessary revolution, a third industrial revolution, etc., etc., etc. Bottom line, this is something connected with a change of paradigm. And let me read the definition of a paradigm for you to see what we have to change. Thomas Kuhn said, paradigm is a system of beliefs and assumptions acting together in order to create a vision of the world, integral, comprehensive, unified, persuasive and convincing, which is equivalent to the reality itself.
Cambiar esa realidad.
What should we do? Change such reality. How? Marking which are the difficulties are and what we should be facing in order to change such realities, because the status quo by people favoring status quo means that no change will happen. So how can we change that paradigm and create a new one, showing lack of connection, weaknesses, failures, and deteriorating the old paradigm so as to create a new one which would be overarching? That idea, that new paradigm, is what we want to demonstrate through this notion of circular economy. Thinking of a society driven to create resources means to recognize that besides biological metabolism known to us all, an industrial metabolism, designing products so that they will be an integral part of a new industrial process by using secondary raw materials coming from recycling processes. Therefore, this would enhance and increase the efficiency of the whole system by creating new value chains. Therefore, this is what we are going to try to share with you in the course of this one-day seminar. Therefore, let me introduce to you which are the difficulties, barriers, challenges, and so on and so forth that we must overcome. Number one, to admit, and no one can deny it, that there is the second law of thermodynamics. Energies goes from being available to being unavailable. Entropy, or loss of system efficiency. This clearly shows you that we have to bear in mind this notion whenever we tackle each of these processes, and Costas this afternoon, who is much more cognizant than myself, will provide you with examples. Number two, as it happens with big changes, all this requires immediate action, even though there must be a transition period first. And this period must be tackled differently if we talk about developed countries and developing countries. So, comparing the stages of development of both countries will lead us to confusion. We should also overcome an ideological barrier, that is to say, the fact that today, in Latin America, in other developing countries, there is an ideological discussion going on. This discussion is also happening in developed countries. Costas is aware of the fact that the British Labour leader, Corbyn, makes use of that ideological background to support his position. In my personal view, this ideology has no longer been romantic so far. It is nostalgic, trying to repeat feats and deeds that happened 40 years ago when the Cold War times meant a different position of many countries in the world. We cannot go back to those times. It is unproductive, and the change of paradigm must be based on giving the right place to the 7 billion inhabitants living in the world today. Find a place for each of them. It's not a matter of having fewer rich people, but we must have fewer poor people and distribute wealth in a much more fair and equitable way. Therefore, ideological discussion has to do with circular economy. This notion sometimes is put forward as something created by big transnationals to take hold on raw materials for their products, thinking about circular economies in order to avoid the supply of raw materials that are produced by developing countries. The ideological discussion will be the following. They are going to tell us this is a new Trojan war that will be, of course, sent to developing economies to prevent them from growing and developing as far as sale of raw materials is concerned, because raw materials may be obtained through recycling processes based on this notion of circular economy. And I say this because we must be ready to answer to this piece of criticism, to this vision. Let me tell you that one of those who embrace the green economy is the People's Republic of China, and this is no accident. So we can think that maybe they have a different vision from other centers of power, but I'd like to share with you a comparison in this regard to see where we should be driving for or heading for. If we want to equalize consumption patterns to the U.S. economy, we are going to need 5 planets, not only one. And in the year 2011, in the USA, there were a consumption of 22 barrels of oil per capita. At the same time, in China, 3 barrels, India, only 1 barrel. So, if we take into account the billion of inhabitants all over the world consuming what the U.S. consumes, we should be heavily dependent on those fossil fuels. This is the crux of the matter. This should be our goal for the future. I do believe that we have to generate more institutions, that is to say, make the institutional framework much stronger, and I mean collective agreements that have been entered into and reached thanks to a better way of living together, having new institutions, new mechanisms to put in place all these notions. This is a political issue. Aristotle said man is zoon politikon. He's a political being. So in order to sustain a political discussion, we need strong political decision-making. This is a process of change. There will be winners and losers. That's natural. I mean, avoiding this thought, and we Latin Americans tend to think in this way, that everything may be solved through laws, regulations, executive orders, but all that legal framework should be related to the real world, and the real world needs incentive creation instead of delving into unproductive discussions. We welcome the participation of religious leaders. They are moral authorities. They can help us change and or adopt those changes in the different behavioral patterns. But in this regards, I must confess you something. You are all adults and you will understand what I am going to tell you. Kings are parents, our parents. We don't have a Pachamama, a Gaia in Latin America that will give us everything. We are human beings. We descend from our parents. We have free will and we have to make our own decisions. And we shouldn't be privileging the First Nations, for instance, because they are aboriginals. Gerald Diamond wrote a book, Collapse, where he tells us that primitive societies, aboriginal peoples, First Nations, may lead us to an overall collapse if they exert undue influence on nature. But, on the other hand, claiming to create special right for the earth or animals, somebody must represent and advocate for those rights. And there we have the discussion, who will advocate for those rights? We have to be much more sensitive in this regard and also avoid practices based on individual decisions that are made thinking, oh my, I'm making a nice contribution, but that contribution is only a marginal contribution. For instance, in order to favor climate change, let's not consume beef. Because beef has a carbon footprint that is very high, or that all food should be organic. But if those 7 billion inhabitants are going to consume organic foods, well, we are happy that in Mars they discovered water, because we will have to travel to Mars to have that water for us. We need water for food production. Therefore, in my opinion, I do believe that we are on the verge of being witnesses to the emergence of a new age. As it happened in the Industrial Revolution times, those witnesses were not aware of the fact that they were witnessing a change of paradigm at the time. So far, this change will be based on the revolution of knowledge. Knowledge and know-how, as Jean-Paul Fitoussi has said, economy is anthropic for resources and historical for production, organization, and dissemination of knowledge. The level of growth that we want to have should be based on an adequate amount of knowledge to ensure survival. Therefore, knowledge is the driving force for us to implement the new changes. We should not only think about fruits and reaping fruits. We have to till the soil, cultivate the land. St. Paul mentioned this in regard to faith and deeds. Faith is no use if you do not do your own deeds. Thank you so much. I'm going to close with a phrase of the encyclical. The authentic care of our life and our relationships with nature is inseparable with fraternity, justice, and loyalty to our neighbors. What we want to have is more equity. Thank you.